So I just want to welcome everyone to the Alternatives to Methodological Naturalism preview session. We've got several people joining on the web, several people who are just dialed in. As I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions during the presentation, you can type them in the chat session, and either I'll ask it to Noel at that time, or we'll wait till the end during questions. So anyway, I hope you enjoy this session. Before we get to our presenter, Noel, I want to take a moment and mention what the conference is about and what we're trying to accomplish. Academics for the last century has largely presumed that the world as we find it is naturalistic. That means that they presume that the universe as we know it is a continual sequence of physical causes, with nothing outside of physics and physical objects having the ability to influence events. This is not just the presumption that goes on in physics, but it's also crept out into the social sciences as well. As you can tell from the title of this conference, we're looking into other ways of viewing the world systematically that don't presuppose this naturalistic vision. Methodological naturalism has done a decent job in providing a framework by which we can judge and criticize the merits of particular claims. And in fact, one of the reasons for its success is that historically, people who disagreed with methodological naturalism have not supplied their own methodologies that are necessary to evaluate nature and claims about nature in a rigorous way. So the goal of this conference is to, first of all, discuss the different types of events, ideas, and causes and relationships that lay outside what's normally considered within methodological naturalism. If one uses methodological naturalism, what sorts of causes, effects, and relationships are not being seen? What are we missing? Second, we're looking to see how methodologies might be constructed which take into account these other sorts of causes, effects, and relationships that are missed by naturalism. And as well, how claims and proposals about these relationships might be rationally evaluated. So today, we're doing the first of two preview sessions. The next one is going to be Monday, April 4th at 7:30 a.m. Central Time. And we're doing it in the morning because our speaker is from Israel. And so if we did it at night, that's the middle of the night for him. And we're having these preview sessions for two reasons. The first is that a lot of people don't know what we mean when we talk about alternatives to methodological naturalism. So I don't know what to expect and what such a conference might look like. And so doing preview sessions allows people to see for themselves the answer to that question. And the second reason is that we actually had two speakers who couldn't make it to the April 16th conference. But we really wanted to include them because we think they have great ideas. Therefore, we put together these two preview sessions, both so that you would get an opportunity to see what our conference is about, and so that we wouldn't miss these two great speakers. So now I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, Noel Rude, and if you can give yourself a quick introduction and introduce our topic for the evening. Thank you.
Well, hello. Hello, everyone. I'm a retired linguist living near the Oregon coast, and not a great theoretician or anything like that, but I think I have something important here to say today. My purpose, the moderator there asked, can you speak? And I am going to argue that unless you believe at some level and know that you are conscious and have free will, you wouldn't be able to speak a human language. It'd be impossible. That the foundation of human language involves, at the very foundation, those concepts are crucial. Also, I need to say that I offer nothing that isn't common knowledge among linguists. But the point is that there's virtually nobody outside the field that knows anything about this. And in my opinion, this speaks rather loudly to the the title of this conference, Alternatives to Methodological Naturalism. The thing I want to say, though, again, to add here, is that most of this information has been discovered in the last 50 years. So if you went to school before that, you probably didn't get any of it, and if you went to school after it, you didn't get any linguistics. So nothing has been added. In fact, they don't even teach grammar, I understand, much anymore. But let's get started here. I think one title, it's my fault, different titles of this paper have gotten out there. One talks about bottom-up versus top-down linguistics. Well, in the 1950s, a bottom-up form of linguistics, or a methodological naturalism, you might say. I don't know if anybody used that term yet then. It was just naturalism, materialism, dominated the field, especially American linguistics. And the idea was you had to look at data, and you analyze that data without any reference to meaning or purpose or function. And the theory or the method of it was based off B.F. Skinner, his stimulus response. It was as if we are like Pavlov's dog. This happens and you respond that way. It's like your Cortina or whatever, your computer voice there, stimulus response. And Noam Chomsky, I'll bring him up here, challenged that in 1959. It was a devastating review of B.F. Skinner, and said that human language has potentially infinite output, that there is no predictability, that is no absolute predictability whatsoever, and that it's just absolutely unlimited. In fact, he noted, and this is very easy to check today, just go through, pick any random sentence out of a newspaper, any medium length, whatever, random sentence, and try to find it again. Today you can do that. You can Google it. And just any average sentence, you're never going to find it out there in the great sea of the internet. It's not going to be there. Virtually everything we say, even my stumbling around here in the exact way, has never been said before. So Chomsky challenged that and introduced a field of linguistics where it was top-down. So it was theory, and he said we can make grammatical judgments. We can rely on our intuitive judgments. A linguist working with an indigenous language, non-written language, non-described, can ask the linguists, the people he's working with, is this sentence okay? Or he can get their reaction. And you can learn to work together with them so they don't judge it culturally, but grammatically. Grammatical judgments are valid, Chomsky said. And so we have a new kind of top-down linguistics. But a bottom-up linguistics is emerging again with neurological studies. There's corpus linguistics and so on. Nevertheless, nothing wrong with that as long as you don't forbid and classify as non-science the other kind. So I guess on the slides here, I don't have the slides, just my own copy of them here, but the first page there says Universals of Language. And that's been a big topic from the beginning, how much of language is shared by all humans and how much it can be limited to individual languages. The question is, are there language universals, and if so, what is their source? And the zeitgeist of yesterday, the middle of the last century, was that we're all the same. And so linguists really went out, they tromped all over the world seeking to show the commonality between all human languages. Today I perceive a political correctness that says we share nothing, that we're all different. And so there's a lot of that out there. If you go to study this subject, are there universals, you'll see that there's a great deal of difference and a growing chorus out there saying we don't share anything. But so now let's switch slides here, and we have at the top I have mentioned a book that just came out recently by Berwick and Chomsky. At the end of the slides here you can see the full reference, and very interesting book. I think people in intelligent design would do well to read it. They are materialists essentially, but arguing for in fact, they might not claim to be materialists, but they argue for a Darwinian, not a Darwinian, but an evolutionary origin of language. But they show, and I believe they rightly show, that all human languages are hierarchical. And Chomsky began his study of grammar back in the 60s with an enormously complicated descriptive apparatus, enormously complex. And it got more complex as they went. And just trying to describe English was enormously complicated. And over the years, they have narrowed that down to where all they say really now is that language is hierarchical. That is, small elements, morphemes, you can call them, meaningful elements are organized into words, words are organized into phrases, phrases into clauses, clauses into sentences, and so on. It's hierarchical. And they have one rule they call merge. You could look that up on the internet and read about it. Very, very, very simple little mathematical rule. In fact, it just shows bifurcation. And so the argument is that what's really unique about human language is this ability to think in hierarchies, and it allows what's called recursion. You can, for example, one sentence can be subordinated, or one clause can be subordinated to another. And they argue that this one particular homologue, I think they might even call it that, I don't remember, is what ultimately tipped the scale and gave humans language. So we share various features, they will say, and I'm not a big expert on any of that, the biology or any of that, but various features with language, with, the creatures. Birds, for example, we share a lot more about sound recognition and patterning than we do with the apes. And there are various features of human intelligence, of the brain and brain activity, etc., that go to make up language. But the one thing they argue that tipped the scale and gave us language is this merge, or this ability to hierarchize. And they have argued from the beginning that this kind of thing is what gives us an unlimited, an infinite potential of sentences. Now, they'd call that a spandrel. I think they might even use that term. It's a characteristic that is a byproduct of the evolution of some other characteristic. In other words, this didn't come along to just give us language somehow. Very simple thing that they think could have happened, and now we have language. Okay, well, I think that is worth looking and reading, looking at, and for critiquing and so on. And I believe they are absolutely right that all human languages use hierarchies. But I do not believe that is necessarily the end of the story by any means, as they wouldn't, and that what's really important is the consciousness and free will level, and I'll explain why. So the next slide there, I talk about the three levels of meaning and our function. Language serves a function. It conveys meanings and various things, information, etc. And there's 3 levels to this. I don't know about other systems, other codes, DNA and so on. I don't know how you would compare it. But let's look at this. We have lexical meaning. That is, words, they have meaning, but it's divorced from information. And this is a major difference that we have with the animals. So animals have things like body language and so on, but for an animal to sit there and contemplate the meaning of a word, independent of any information, for an animal to make a dictionary and list the meaning of a word, but not giving you any information other than what that meaning is, that's unheard of outside of the human race. So words have meaning. And this is a lot more complicated than one would think. There are whole fields or areas of linguistics where they study that, lexical semantics. And how do we, with a finite number of words in any human vocabulary, deal with the infinity of reality? The subject is extraordinarily complex. One of the things that anybody interested in that I would recommend is prototype theory that developed with Eleanor Roche in the 70s, and probably most linguists now are favorable to that. And it's unlike the analysis of semantics of the philosophers. Now the next level is clauseal information. So the minimal unit of information in human language is the clause. That is, you have to put 2 words together before you can have information. So I could just say the word go, and there's no information unless I go. If I put a pronoun with it or a noun, you show who went. There's no information. Now, someone might say, well, look, you can have a single word as a sentence. Well, that's right in language, but you have to be able to reconstruct the other part of it. So somebody can say, who's there? And you can answer, Bill. But that means Bill is there. I'm here. My name's Bill. So you can answer in context, you can leave words out, and that's true in all languages. You could leave out words, but they have to be reconstructible to convey the information you want. And then the third area is discourse coherence. And that is, humans don't just walk up and utter a sentence or a clause. They don't just walk up and say, it's beautiful today, and then walk away. No, that can happen, but that's not your normal language use. We speak in discourse. One clause, one sentence follows another. Some of us talk too long. But all human language occurs in discourse and in different forms. We call them genres. There is conversation, there's narrative, there's laws, etc., expository, all of that, but it's all one clause follows another. And there are rules there of coherence. So you walk up and say, the sun is shining. And then you say, it snowed in Denver. And then you say, 2 plus 2 is 4. You don't string clauses together that have no relationship to one another. The interesting thing here is that most of grammar resides in the coherence. Most of grammar, the tense, the aspect, the modalities, all of that is linking the clauses together. So that's interesting. That's where most of the stuff in grammar, the affixes, the prefixes, suffixes, and the word orders and so on, most of it is generally doing that. But let's narrow our focus. Next slide there just says, page 4, clauseal information. So the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about that. And so how does human language convey information? What kind of information does it give? And by the way, with animals, I should say that there are codes, but they tend to be finite codes, like the bee language. They can tell you precisely where and how much nectar there is, but they can't extend it out and talk about nuclear physics, for example. And then most animal, your dog and so on, they're very good with body language, just as we are. But human language conveys complex information. So with body language, if that's all we had, and I'm not talking about sign language, that's full human languages, sign languages for the deaf, but just body language, smiles and looks and movements and so on. If that's all we had, you couldn't explain very much complexity at all. You explain your attitudes and how the way you look at something and your happiness or sadness or whatever, but that would be it. And I don't know how this differs, what linguists talk about, from what the information theorists are talking about completely, other than the fact that the linguists are interested in what you're actually communicating. And I think information theory is more into quantifying and so on. But it would be interesting for some cross-fertilization between the fields, I think. Now, let's go to the next chart there, slide, and I introduce a topic. And now from here on, this is going to get pretty dense. Oh my, looks like I've used up a lot of my time already, so I'm going to go fast, and you may find it very difficult. Students typically do. Some of this is like when you introduce the limit in calculus. You've got so many variables that we're talking about. But verbs, every language has verbs. Yes?
Quick, don't worry too much about the time. Since we don't have anyone speaking after you, so
okay.
Don't be slow, but don't worry about it.
Okay. Well, as I said earlier, this is common knowledge to linguists, and many of them I've sensed they don't like it, but it's what we found out. And it hasn't bled out into the general public. So I think it is important that people interested in this conference and intelligent design and contra-materialism type subjects, could be quite important just to understand the argument here. So it turns out that languages have something we call a verb, a word that codes a state or an event, states or events. And some people claim they've found a language that doesn't, and you start looking at it, yeah, they do, they really do, but in some way they'll make an argument they don't. But, just try to find a language that doesn't, and all languages have verbs, or words that function as verbs. Now, part of the meaning of a verb is the participants involved in the state or the event. So how many participants are involved and what their roles are. So let's just look at some examples here. A verb snow or rain. It snowed. We put it out there, but linguists have often said that's a zero predicate, a zero place predicate. So a verb, meteorological verbs can be considered as zeros. Then a word like die, it just has one, just one person. He died. But kill has two participants, and give has three. So John gave money to his friend. So you got three things there in a verb like give. Teach is like that. Show is like that. Now, do any events have more participants than three? Well, of course. Let's say the commercial event, that has four participants. The buyer, the seller, and then you're exchanging two items, money and some item that you want. Items change hands. But in human language, we lexicalize up to three and no larger, no more. So we got verbs for the commercial event that focus from different perspectives. We got sell and buy and pay and cost. And so they'll focus on certain ones of these participants. Now, then, aside from the, and in fact, this type of thing here was first elucidated in a 1958 book, came out by Lucien Tenial, the idea of verbal valence based on analogy of chemistry, although chemistry can have up to a 4 valence and verbs have up to 3. But in any clause you can tack on what linguists call obliques. So the core participants are those implied in the meaning of the verb, and the obliques are temporal, manner, things like in the morning, yesterday, out on the playground. You can tack that on, just those kind of things on any verb, any clause. They're obliques, and their meaning isn't specifically implied in the meaning of the verb. Okay, then let's go to the next slide here, introduce the next concept. This kind of evolved out of stuff that was occurring in what we call the Prague School in the first part of the 20th century. And Roman Jakobson and others that came over to the United States continued it, and there's quite a long history of thinking about this. But the state we are in now is there are 3 basic core participants implied in the meaning of verbs. And these are, as you see on your on the slide there, I'll give you the technical terms that are generally used by linguists. The agent, so that is the animate instigator of an event, the on purpose instigator, the one who initiates or performs an event. And by the way, people that claim, there's no such thing as cause and effect or free will or consciousness or any of that, are they going to make a claim that there's some language out there that can't express the difference between cause and effect? I generally don't hear them go that far, but there isn't. That's a major thing people talk about. So the first semantic role here is agent. The next, generally called a dative, but it's based off, if any of you know grammar, the dative case in European languages. But here we're talking not just structure, formal structure of a language, but we're talking about semantics. And the term dative is the most common one used. And that's any argument, we call these arguments, the participants in the event or state, whose consciousness is relevant to that event or state. What's an example of that? Well, for example, let's say she was embarrassed. You need to be conscious to be embarrassed, but you're not an agent. So consciousness is important. The verb see in English takes a dative subject. You can see, but you can see whether you try to or not. And the difference between look and see in English is look takes a subject that's an agent, and see takes a subject that's a dative. Some languages blur that distinction with one verb, but in English that's made there. That's just an example of that. And then the patient, and some people use the word theme in some grammars, that's everything else. That's whatever participant is not the agent and not conscious. That consciousness isn't relevant. So you could, if you said John died, that's a patient because his consciousness isn't relevant. He could be asleep, for example. Okay, let's look now at what's called the accessibility hierarchy. See, we're trying to get at universal grammar here, an ability to look at all human languages with the same common language and linguistics. So linguists drew up a thing they called the accessibility hierarchy. and most accessible to various things in grammar is the agent. Next the patient, the dative, and next the patient. And in English, for example, if you have the simplest type of a sentence possible with the verb give that has all three of these semantic roles, English puts the verb second, and then the other nouns have to occur in that order. Bill gave Alice money. If you want to change the order of this accessibility hierarchy, you have to add words. Bill gave money to Alice. Or you could say money was given to Alice by Bill, etc. So the accessibility hierarchy will be necessary now on our next slide. So let's go to that. What we're talking about is what we call grammatical relations. And that's like in English, those of you that know some grammatical terms, in English we have subject and object and indirect object, etc. is grammatical relations. But if we're going to talk about all languages, then we have to work up to it this way, because you start looking at another language and they may be very different or appear very different. So we have what we call syntactic primitives. These are just forced on you by the putting words together, and this is what you have. And I should have put S first there. That's the core argument of an intransitive verb, or of a verb with just one participant. That would be it, and we call it an S. So a one participant verb. Fall, he fell down. Fall, that's an S. John fell down. A is the core argument in a transitive verb, highest on the accessibility hierarchy. So notice A doesn't necessarily mean agent, but in a verb like see, John saw the tree. The tree is a patient. What's John? Well, John will say is dative, because in English, he could accidentally seen the tree. He saw the tree. He just opened his eyes and saw it. He didn't have to work. If you meant he tried to see it, you say look. He looked at the tree. He made himself see it. So it turns out the verb see takes a dative and a patient. So in a transitive verb there, the argument, the participant that's highest on that hierarchy we call A, and then the lowest one we call O. So John saw the tree. John is A and tree is O. John killed the elk. John is A, agent in that sense. Elk is O. And then the D is the argument has relevant consciousness. And I'm not going to go into that much. So all you need to know for the rest of this is the S, A, and the O. Now, let's go to the next slide. And we'll see how verbs are fall into different slots. Our traditional terms, some may, if you haven't studied grammar for a long time, you may not remember these, but a single participant verb, or a single place predicate, we could call it, is called intransitive. And that would include verbs like rain, fall, pain, I pain, and run. And notice, so in a single, an S, those all take an S, a single participant there. That could be a zero, or it could be a patient or a dative or an agent. Then a two-place predicate, which is normally, historically we call transitive, that could have the following. See, as I said already, can take a dative, has a dative and a patient in English, see. Kill has an agent and a patient. Embarrass has an agent and a dative. John embarrassed her. She had to be conscious to be embarrassed, and if he did it on purpose. And see, in prototype semantics, if you say that, then the understanding is on purpose. And if you intend otherwise, you have to say John accidentally embarrassed her. Now, the third is the ditransitive. That's the term historically used, or if you have three participants. And remember, the valence of a verb goes up to 3, and give is 1. And it takes all 3, the agent, the dative, and the patient. Teach would be the same thing. She taught them mathematics. So you got she, them, and mathematics. You got she, agent, them is the dative, and mathematics, a patient. So that's your basic verb types. Now let's move on to what we call syntactic alignment. I hope this is clear. Sometimes this blows students' minds in the university. And we normally take a lot more classes or spend a lot more hours on this, give a lot more examples. But let's move on to slide 9 there. And that is, when you go to other languages, they're doing it so differently that people have thought, man, they're not doing the same thing at all. They're not doing what we're doing. And there's an old thing that linguists say, linguists that are field linguists that go out into the big bad world out there and start to work on, go into New Guinea or somewhere and start to try to describe a language that, might be very, very different from English. And so the immediate sense they get is, oh, this is so different. Man, they don't share anything with us. But then as time goes by, what seems to amaze everyone, and I've gone through this myself, working with native languages along the Columbia River and in Mexico, is the longer you work, the more amazed you get. They're doing just what we do. Same thing. And so the way we relate grammatical relations, we say that they mediate things like subject, object, and indirect object. They mediate between these semantic roles that I've described. That's consciousness, agency, and neither of those, and coherence. So the rest of grammar, remember I said, has to do with coherence, and that's enormously complicated and involved. But things like subject and object and so on mediate between these semantic roles and coherence. The thing we have to say is that all human languages can distinguish these semantic roles, and they can also string clauses together and be coherent in their own language. Now, it turns out it's called alignment, syntactic alignment, and there are variations. And so we have a new vocabulary that's been developing. So the traditional European, Latin, Greek, if you've studied any of those languages, German, and English works exactly the same way, but we don't do it with suffixes on our nouns. But you have the nominative and the accusative case. Now notice I'm just showing you two kinds, not the ditransitive, but the intransitive and the transitive clauses. Remember, the intransitive is when you have just one participant implied by the verb, which remember we call an S. And then remember in the transitive, it's the one we call A is highest on the hierarchy I gave, and O is the lowest. Okay, a nominative case, as in Latin or Greek, and the subject in English, we blur the S and the A and treat the O differently. So in English, we put the S and the A before the verb. John fell down versus John murdered Bill. we put both of them, whether it's the A or the S, they come before the verb, and then the O comes after. She read the book. The book is the O, and it comes afterwards. In Basque, for example, they do it in the second way there, the ergative absolutive. And so the ergative case is where you treat the A in the transitive clause distinctly and separately. In Basque, that takes a K suffix. So gisona is the man, gisonak. That tells you right away that's an A in the transitive clause. And then they blur the difference between the S and the O. So John fell down and Bill murdered John. John in both cases would be treated the same. Now, a lot of languages mix them up. So in Hindi, the last time my memory isn't always good, but the last time I remember checking, in Hindi, they separate out the A. That's got a ne suffix. So Ram ne, Ram did something or other. Sita ko. So you do it on the ergative absolutive way, but in the past tense. And in the present and future, if I remember correctly, they do it like we would in English. So those are called split systems. Now, one of the languages I happened to work with was Nez Perce in Idaho and into Oregon. And I found out it separates all three out, treats them separately. And other people have commented, as far as I know now, there's only 2 languages in the world we know of that do that. And then the fourth thing there is what they call active stative languages. Ket along the Yenisei River is said to be like that. Klamath, a language I worked with near Crater Lake, which sadly now is dead, completely dead, they did it that way. And that is, you separate your subject and object in a transitive clause, but in intransitive clauses, you distinguish the S's as to whether they are agentive or datives, whether consciousness or agency is involved or not. And there are in the Caucasus Mountains, there are supposed to be languages like that. Even Georgian is reputed to be that way, but I don't know. I haven't worked with it. Okay, then let's move on real quickly here. I have some examples, and if you have a way to preserve that, you can think about it. I probably should have, I did Google Translate for the Hebrew there. The king went, and probably should have the verb first in modern Hebrew. But anyway, so halach hamelech, or however it's said, the king went. So there's an example. There's no marker that tells you that the king is the subject. That's an intransitive clause. But in the king built the house, hamelech bana et habayth, or habayit, however it's pronounced. Notice the et there. Apparently in a lot of modern Hebrew, that'd be tabayit, rapidly spoken Hebrew. The et there is the marker of the accusative case. So Hebrew there, modern Hebrew and ancient Hebrew both, and in fact all the Semitic languages, are nominative accusative. Now, you go to Sumerian, which is the first language ever to be written, excuse me, that we know of. Many people now say that the earliest Sumerian writing goes back something like 5,500 years ago. And that's in southern Iraq. And that language has probably, nearly 1,000, well over 1,500 year history. something like that, 1,500-year history where it was the language. And then it became a classical language of the Assyro-Babylonians. And it's unrelated to any modern language or any other language we know of. It's an isolate, we call it. But they've left, the Sumerians themselves have left thousands of tablets. And fortunately, the Akkadians wrote dictionaries and grammars of Sumerian. You know, nobody worries about language is so, we take it so much for granted that we never give it a thought. We study everything on earth except language. The only time people have ever started studying language is when they worry about learning another language. The only time it makes sense where you put the verb in the sentence is when you're studying Japanese now and you learn the verb comes last and then the auxiliary after that. So the Akkadians started writing grammars. And notice here, Sumerian, and it isn't, you know, the linguistics has been gained in the last 50 years, is now being applied to Sumerian too. We know Sumerian is ergative absolutive. So Lugal Bangen, the king went, and their verb final, and Lugal is king, big man. And no suffix or prefix or anything marking out the subject in the intransitive verb, but in the transitive verb it's lugale, and then a is house, and mundu is built. So the king built the house, and you specially mark with a suffix the word king. So that would be what we call the ergative case. And then I put an example from Nez Perce there. The chief went. Hikuya miochat. The chief went. It's a very free word order language. I could say miochat hikuya. And I can scramble words in the second clause there in Nez Perce any way you wanted to. The word order there has to do with coherence and not with who does what to whom. But there, notice then miochatom pania inine. So the there is the ergative case, and then they have an accusative. So we call the absolute, you don't put anything on the noun there. That's your S case, and then the ergative in the transitive clause, and then the ne on the accusative. Okay, those are just examples for you, and I think I'm going to stop here. This can get very, very complicated. But also, I think it's simple. It's simpler probably in reality than the kind of things most of the people out there are studying. But it's something every child has to be able to grapple with and learn, to learn a language. But it's just something we've never thought of much. So I'm ready if anybody has criticism, critiques, or whatever.
Okay. I think to manage this, so we don't all talk at once, if anyone has, so we'll start and do questions from people who are on the web, and if you have a question or a comment, just type in yes in the chat window, and I'll go to you specifically, and and then after we do those, we'll open it up to people who are dialed in. And then I actually have my own questions, but I'll save them for last. So,
Okay.
Does anyone on the web have any questions? Let's see here. All right, I don't have any questions on the web. Let me see. I need to figure out how to get this out of presentation mode. Hold on just a minute. All right. So I didn't have anyone chiming in from the website, so I'll open it up for anyone who's dialed in or on the web. Does anyone have any questions for Noel? All right, if I don't have any questions, I'll go ahead and pop my own. I was listening to your talk, and first of all, when you mentioned at the very beginning that all sentences are unique, or most sentences are unique, it reminded me of the way that teachers check for plagiarism these days. And they Google the first sentence of a paper. And if they find a hit in Google, chances are that it's been plagiarized, because rarely do you ever have a full sentence that's not unique.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's good. That is the thing, that human language is open-ended. I'm sure there's things that humans can't understand. Sometimes I think philosophers and scientists believe they understand everything, but I don't think we do. Nevertheless, human language is completely open-ended, that we know no limits as to what we can talk about. And I don't know if I got my point across, but my point was that, and maybe people could tell me whether that came across or not, that the structural principles of language, as Chomsky said, I think he's right, are minimal. He now has very simple rules of that. Human language is hierarchical and structured. I don't know if all codes are. Perhaps they are. I don't know. Nevertheless, the functional features of language are utterly complex, and nevertheless they are universal. And the most important of these, at the information level, it starts in the clause, are cause and effect relationships, consciousness, and on purpose. And I know how, for example, David Perlmutter and Paul Postal noted this early on, and as a critique of the transformational grammar, which refused to look at meaning at the time. And they noted that this is important, so they identified these three semantic roles, but they called them primitives, but they didn't want to talk about consciousness and so on, so they called them 1, 2, and 3. And you have a whole tradition there of wonderful work that was done, much of this information revealed by what was called relational grammar. So if people take away anything from this, it's that I don't think you could understand language. You can argue very cogently that you couldn't understand a human language unless you really did understand what consciousness and agency are, free will, being responsible.
And to bring that back to a comment you made earlier, animal languages don't possess this sort of conscious relationship.
There again, I think we can go like Descartes.
Hold on just a second.
Animals are robots; they're just machines. And all the way to touchy-feely people who are thinking they're exactly like us. Animals do understand if there's an agent out there, the difference between an inert rock and an agent and various things. They just don't have language. Mm-hmm. They can't talk about it in the same way. All their communication systems are either like our body language or they're very limited, like the bee language.
I have a question. This is Arminius. If you have ever been consulted or about language understanding, artificial intelligence, and for example, Siri, ability of machines to understand human language, it seems that your principles of language, hierarchical, and I would say that should be essential for a computer engineer which try to teach a machine how to understand a little bit the natural language.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Would a machine understand it just as well if the S, A, and O, instead of knowing what they are, just label them 1, 2, and 3, or just have a symbol there, and have it work like a machine. But do they really, this is a philosopher's question, do they really know what it's like? Well, as Thomas Nagel asks, how can you know what it's like to be a bat? How about a human? Can the machine really know? If the machine could say, you could, Alexa, did that embarrass you? And they programmed it to respond something. Could the machine really be embarrassed? Does it have consciousness that could be embarrassed? So there's really two issues here. One is what I've tried to present. The idea of agency and consciousness are absolutely vital to understanding language, that you know what those are. We understand them alike, whether we're a headhunter in New Guinea or a university professor that claims they don't exist. On the other hand, there's a philosophical question, what are those really? And can machines be built that would know that? And people can argue that and should be arguing it, but I don't, how can I be too dogmatic one way or the other here? Does that make sense?
Yes, makes sense. I totally agree with you that it would be extremely difficult for a machine to understand, to get the meaning, the absolute meaning. A machine can do mostly mechanical things which may approximate a little bit of understanding, but may be difficult to understand subtleties and
right. Yeah.
But another topic, it seems that there is a inclination to see a relationship, a significant relationship between language and intelligence. That seems to be a strong relationship between the essence of intelligence and our ability to speak or to express ideas or even intention or to speak a language.
I would, of course, linguists are biased that way. They love language, and people that devote their life to this would agree with you thoroughly. It turns out, humans, for example, have this incredible ability to, like birds, listen to singers and opera singers and so on. And the way humans in music as well as language can perceive sequences of sound and intonations and harmonics and so on. And all human languages are like that. And yet the deaf can readily learn sign language and apply all the same kind of things I'm talking about here. For example, I don't know if it's true for sure, but at a conference I saw a lady signing for the deaf. And I asked her, how do you do pronouns? And she said that, well, you place them. So she'd place them at her right side. So you sign for the noun, and then you put it, and you have three places at your right, if she was correct. I'm no expert on that. So you have three levels then of topic. Well, it turns out in human languages there are three levels. We call it topicality. The human attention span and so on seems to work up to three things in your short-term memory of the participants, and so your coherence is dealing with that. There's a whole book after book written on what they call it third-person reference tracking. That is, when people talk about something, how is it, you can be talking rapidly, that we can keep track of the things they're talking about? These are profound questions that we never really think about because we speak language in the same way we walk. We don't think about what muscle we're moving at the particular time. We don't think about exactly how you hold your foot and the arc of your body and so on. You just learn to do it without thinking. And human language is like that. Your consciousness focuses on what you're trying to say, and it seems like the rest flows from the subconscious. And if you know a language, you don't really have to pause. And now let's see, am I using ergative syntax here or nominative accusative? And You don't do any of that. I don't know how this can be used in intelligent design, except for the fact that we can argue, we can use this as one argument for the fact that we are conscious. Oh, and that we do have free will, because what agent really means in this semantic role sense in languages when we work with them is that the person is doing something on purpose, and thus he's morally responsible. And all societies understand that. In all languages, you know, little children understand that even before they start talking. Do something that isn't exactly right and look at their faces. And so humans and even the animals, I think, are geared to distinguish agency from inert mechanical action. I remember once in a class, a student wanted to know, will you work with animists, people that believe everything is conscious and alive? Do they make any distinctions? And it turns out the languages I've worked with are of people that are animists, and yet their grammars even distinguish it more than English. That languages tend to overcode and undercode. So Chinese might be an example of undercoding. There's not very much grammatical suffixes, prefixes, etc. And yet they can do nuclear physics in Chinese, as far as I know. And the languages I've worked with in the Pacific Northwest absolutely overcode. I've joked before on the tribe there, told the joke, the Lone Rangers, the Apaches are coming. What do we do now? And Tonto replies, what do you mean we, white men? You couldn't tell that in the Indian languages I worked with because you make so many grammatical distinctions that we, you have inclusive, exclusive, dual, and so on, and plural we, and then all the cases. So languages tend to either overcode or undercode, and sometimes animist societies even overcode for what's conscious and animate and capable. And you know the Indian hunter out there, he has to know whether, he knows a rock isn't going to attack him, but another person or a grizzly might. Anyway, hopefully there's more comments or critiques.
One thing I picked up when you mentioned recursion, being able to what allows for kind of the free expression of language. That's actually it's very interesting because that's an area that I focus on in computer programming, and that recursion also in computer programming is the point at which you make the transition from being something being a domain-specific static structure to something that has free expression.
Yeah, this was the big thing that Chomsky has argued. The criticism has been that we still could have an infinite number of constructions if you consider discourse, but the form they call the Chomskyan type linguistics the formalists, the formalist school. Some call them structuralists, and their main focus was sentences. And see, sentences, if you went to grade school very long ago, you learned you have main clauses and subordinate clauses. So you can say, I want, and then Alice to read that book. So Alice to read that book is a clause. It's a subordinate clause, and it's the direct object of I want. What I want is that. And you have relative clauses and that there is an object complement, and we have subject complements and so on, and that's recursion. Is that similar to what you do? And I imagine it is.
Yeah.
And the rule. Excuse me.
Yeah, it is. It goes further than that, but that's kind of the starting point.
And you could say the same thing goes on up in human language. Sentences are organized into paragraphs, and so you could have a paragraph node, if somebody's speaking very coherently, and typically in the world, maybe people need to be relatively coherent to be listened to. I shouldn't say that in case everybody's tuning out. A big critique has come up in recent years. Now that I have a problem naming people, I know the guy actually. I can't think of his name, but he's claiming that he found a language, Piraha, in South America that doesn't have recursion. And but what he really means is that they cannot say, I believe that gold is good. They would say, I believe gold is good. So that it turns out semantically they do have recursion. It's just that he can't find a little structural thing like that, and or like when I said, I want Mary to eat the banana. To eat, see, signifies that's a subordinate clause. You use an infinitive in a subordinate clause. So it turns out, even if he's right, that they have no way to subordinate clauses structurally. They do it semantically in meaning.
Gotcha.
And all human languages do that. Nobody's ever said they didn't do that. So the big furor out there that we now have a language that doesn't do that, and sort of the implication, although this man he's a pretty friendly man, and I communicate with him even, and isn't malicious. But some people are thinking, that we've finally found a link between us and the apes. And of course, in today's multicultural climate, there's no distinction between the apes and us anyway. Back in Darwin's time, showing humans very close to the ape was their racism, and it was evil. Today you can show that, and that's good.
All right, so let's see if are there any other questions that we have, or we're kind of running kind of long, so I don't want to keep everyone too long. But if we have more questions, I'd like to address them.
So I might abuse and ask Noel two more questions. First of all, Noel, how many languages do you know or speak? And then a little bit about your opinion about the origin of languages. I remember reading there are about 3,000 languages or dialects. If you have any opinion about the Tower of Babel, I am Romanian. Romanian, you know, is a Romanic language, and some languages derive from a common language later, or all of them originated at the same time. And any personal opinions regarding the origin of language?
Well, boy, that opens a hornet's nest thing, and I have my own opinions on the Tower of Babel and so on, which I probably wouldn't want to get into. You want to send me a thing privately, and I might exchange on that. Essentially, the diversity of human languages as far as common origin. Yeah, for example, do we believe in a common origin of human language? Indo-European, for example, its earliest texts go back close to the time, if not even before, what would be the Tower of Babel. I said I wasn't going to get into that, but you have the deep diversity of human language, and I'm talking not about grammatical differences, but common origins. So for example, French and Spanish and Italian and so on are Romance languages from Latin, and then Latin from older Indo-European, which other families are Germanic and Armenian and Indic and Greek and Slavic and so on. All go back to a family called Indo-European. Then there are people, the Russians really got into this. You have Shevoroskin and others. They were really into common origin of human language. But they have to project back an enormous amount of time. And if you want to look up, I have this problem with names. It may come to me. The man that dealt with in fact, he first worked in the area of Nez Perce, where I did, and he dealt with a subject he called glottal chronology. It turns out human languages, on average, overthrow about this equal amount of vocabulary every century. And so you look at two languages, and here's another interesting thing. It works unlike theoretical science. You cannot prove that two languages are not related, but you can prove that they are related by showing the certain commonalities and so on. You never know whether you have not discovered it yet. I might extend that then to, we cannot prove that all human languages come from a common source, but we can prove, for example, that Hebrew and Akkadian and Arabic and Aramaic and Ge'ez and so on are from a common source, or we can give a very good evidence for that. But the problem you face, like Shevoroskin, is that you have to go back an enormous amount of time. In the North America here, the American Indian languages, you have families, languages so incredibly different. They share all that I said today, but I mean in every opposite way you could possibly imagine. And seemingly you can't reconstruct a common ancestor for a lot of them. So if they are related, they would go back probably as maybe 10, 12, 15,000, whatever the people are saying now about the crossing over from Bering Strait. So I'm blithering, I think, but it's a good question and one everybody thinks about. That's certainly interested in the Bible and all of that, and I would hate to have an argument and a debate there, although I'm interested in that myself.
All right. Other questions? All right. Well, Noel, thank you so much for your time, and thank all of you who are participating, and I just appreciate everyone's time tonight. And the conference website is at am-nat.org. That's am-nat.org, and we're going to have another preview session on Monday morning at 7:30 on April 4th, and that's going to have Dr. Sam Rakover is going to talk about methodological dualism in psychology. So I hope to see you all there, and Noel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.